Hello and welcome to this virtually social catch-up. I'm Jamie Gallagher and today we're going to be exploring museum engagement. Welcome to the show. We've got three fantastic panellists today. We've got Dan Vo, Florence Schechter and Stephen Welsh, who are going to take us through what innovative and excellent engagement means inside the museum sector. Let's start off with some introductions from the room. First of all, we're going to go to Dan Vo. Hello, Dan.
Hi everyone. So yes, Museum from Home is my thing. I'm also multitasking at the moment. I'm running a Twitter takeover for Queer Britain. Ta-da! So I do audience engagement at the Victorian Albert Museum, where I do LGBTQ plus tours there, as well as Gaitha Ganetha Tol Cardiff. So fingers crossed to Caitlin and Vaughan, I've got that right. It's the National Museum Cardiff, and also 7 museums across Cambridge. So I've just been appointed the new project manager of the Queer Heritage and Collections Network. That's a partnership formed of the National Trust, English Heritage, Historic England, Historic Royal Palaces, the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries. It's seed funded by the Art Fund. We're looking for more funding, but it's already in that one pot. We've got about 900 properties to queer, and also look at engagement in terms of how we bring in audiences, and that includes LGBTQ plus audiences.
Thanks for that, Dan. Next, we're going to go to the founder of the world's first vagina museum. Florence, over to you.
Oh, that was pretty close. Schechter is my name. Florence is the first one. I am the founder and director of the Vagina Museum, the world's first, which is based in Camden Market at the moment. I actually have a background in science communication, so that's what I was doing before all of this. I was a freelance science communicator, so I'm very excited to be here.
Thanks, Florence. We'll be hearing more from you later. Our third panellist, or our third introduction for today's show, Stephen, over to you.
Oh yeah, there I am, guys. Yeah, almost right, Joby. So that's Repatriation. So I'm Stephen Welsh, and up until several months ago, I've been working in museums for the past 15 years. So I've been a curator at the International Slavery Museum, and for the past 13 of those 15 years, I was the curator of living cultures at Manchester Museum at the University of Manchester. So responsible for a collection of 18,000 objects that were acquired in the late 19th century as a consequence of colonialism that come from all over the world, and mostly from people and cultures and communities who were colonized by the British. So over, those past 15 years working on slavery, colonialism, racism, what I'm really interested in and what I've tried to do is explore and embed practices around decolonization, repatriation, but also co-curation. So what I'll do today is share with you a couple of my experiences of working on the groundbreaking project at Manchester Museum, the South Asia Gallery, which is being entirely co-produced and co-curated, but also the work that we did towards the end of 2019, early 2020 to unconditionally repatriate 43 secret, sacred and ceremonial objects to Australia's First Nations peoples. But I've also got another unique insight. So from 2016, I've been a committee member for the National Heritage Lottery Fund North. So I'm really interested in not only museum professionals and their practice and what we do in museums, but also how engagement is funded and how those projects are created, and how we can think about changing them.
Thanks. So that's our panel for today. We're now going to cycle back round and hear what each of them has to say. What makes innovative, excellent and engaging practice inside museum? Dan, let's go back to you.
So I'm thrilled to also realize that Sarah is in here, who does Science from Home. So that's our very good friends of Museum from Home. So thank you very much, Sarah, because Sarah taught me how to say in Makaton, Museum from Home. And so I adopted that at some point during the engagement, because I think that's very much what the practice at the V&A is for us as well. So I started doing the tours there 5 years ago. As far as I'm concerned, even under lockdown, we've delivered an LGBTQ tour at the end of the month, last Saturday of the month, every month since, because we've switched on the camera and we've done it via our interwebies, and we've had great views. I think for the V&A tours alone, we probably had about 20,000 views across all of Museum from Home. The count at the moment is around about 250,000 views. So it's and we've just had Mark Gatiss come on, and that's just completely skewed my statistics up to this point as well, because it was just so wonderful and fabulous. So at the V&A, when we do LGBTQ tours, we train up volunteers to do it, and we use their lived experience as part of the telling of the stories. And so you're using that element of co-curation and blending in their lived experiences as well. And it's really important for me that we try and be as inclusive as possible. And so as values led, we sort of sit down at the table at the start of any training that I do, and we'll ask the question, who's missing from the table right now? And who here at the table has a minority voice, an often minoritized voice that needs amplifying? So how can we support you getting your story across? And really the goal of that is to say that we are completely trans inclusive, and non-binary inclusive, and at the moment that's a key focus for me, based on what's happening in the world around us at the moment, and how as part of LGBTQ plus engagement, they are often the ones that are bullied the most. And so part of making sure that we amplify their voice, it's also about the way that we select the objects that are on these tours and the way that we tell those stories. And having more diverse people around the table means that the objects we look at, that interpretation is going to be a lot more diverse. I don't have time to go into it, but I can certainly find a way to drop in, or I can send it to you later, Jamie, to send in a video just about looking at. I've just done a series of classes for high school and for primary school, and it was about how we use art and history in order to teach children, so primary school and high school level, about the fact that everyone deserves love, and that we should be open and inclusive as possible. And a lot of that is using objects that tell of an ancient history prior to colonialization, and that violent colonial contact that happens around the world, and the introduction of the British laws of buggery or sodomy that goes all around the world. How do we look beyond that and look into the ancient past from all parts of the world, and therefore show kids or people who come on the tours, adults as well, that if you look further back in time, there was a completely different understanding of gender and sexuality, and so the existence of LGBTQ plus people is ancient. We exist across place, time, and culture, and so that, I think, is the most important thing for me. It is opening up the museum, and we've done that with 7 museums in Cambridge, and that's not just an art-based museum like the V&A. There's also science. We've got the Whipple, the Sedgwick, so that's another science-based museum, but also Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. So that is about world history, and really saying that we celebrate queer histories. So if you are LGBTQ plus, come and see us, because we are sharing these stories. We are of the community, for the community. And I think what I'll say is, to kind of finish up, is that one of the most important engagements, most meaningful moments for me, is we had the Refugee Flag flying at the V&A, and I take people there to kind of remind them of that law that went around the world. And lots of countries at the moment are still trying to repeal that, or overturn that, reform their own country's laws that was introducing a British law. More than half of the countries where it's illegal to be homosexual, it is the law that came out of Britain. And so we sort of use the refugee flag as a way of sort of saying there are so many refugees in the world at the moment who are seeking to escape the places where they've come from because of those laws, and we're responsible for that. And so we should remember that when we talk about refugees, that we're also talking about LGBTQ plus people. And there was 3 women who stayed until everybody left and approached me, and they sort of said, yeah, we've just come off a plane from one of those countries. The punishment in our country is stoning by death, being stoned to death. And if you'd said anything that you had in a public arena, as you did today, where we're from, you'd instantly be put in jail. And so, they had deliberately flown and come to see us, because for an hour in the museum, they were able to just freely be themselves. So, yeah, that was a really meaningful, amazing moment for me. And we've actually got the LGBTQ Refugee Week tour that's coming on tomorrow as well. So that's actually the penultimate Museum from Home. So that's episode 81. So tomorrow, if you log on at 12:30 Museum from Home, there's the V&A Refugee Week tour. V&A has always been a hub for Refugee Week, and we've always partnered with them. And we've always done a Refugee Week LGBTQ plus tour. So we're talking about people like Freddie Mercury or Rotimi Feni-Kyoto, one of my favorite photographers. He's a black photographer, and so his work is really, really poignant right now as well with Black Lives Matter. And Marlene Dietrich is another amazing, glamorous, famous, one of the most famous refugees of all time. And being able to pull in all the different perspectives that relate to LGBTQ plus history, but also relate to world history, I think is a really important part of that engagement.
Excellent. Thanks for those thoughts, Dan. Showing us how really showcasing a community, inviting a community and working with them can enhance the museum for everyone. Museums in recent years have really changed their practice. They are now about opening themselves up and saying you are represented and welcome here. So it's really nice to hear those great practice examples. Next, we're going to come to Florence, and Florence saw a gap in the museum market and worked to found her very own museum that was funded through crowdsourcing. This is a project that's absolutely wonderful, and if you are able to contribute to help support this museum during lockdown, I really do encourage it. So Florence, tell us how you go about setting up a museum and what the ethos of that museum is.
Hi. So I set up the Vagina Museum because I discovered that there is a penis museum in Iceland, which is fantastic, don't get me wrong, but there was no vagina equivalent anywhere in the world, and I was like, well, guess I'm making one now. And that's what I basically just decided to do it. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized we could actually do a lot of good with it. There's so much stigma around the vagina, the vulva, and that part of the body. So you might have seen in the poll, I've asked, did the word vagina make you uncomfortable? This is something that we've always struggled with, and it's kind of why we exist. For example, when we were registering with the Charity Commission, we literally had to we had to make a case about why we were called the Vagina Museum, because the person who worked at the Charity Commission was worried that people would find our charity name offensive. And I had to say, well, it's just a scientific word. And when it comes to engagement, that stigma is really, really important to what we do, and it really informs what we do, because we want to fight that stigma whilst also acknowledging that it exists. And so at the heart of everything we do is tone. And I know that sounds like something really boring and like you don't have to think about it. It's like at the root of everything, we have to hit the right tone, or we're going to turn off people, we're going to disengage people. So for us, it's about getting the exact right balance between not being too heavy and not being too lighthearted. Because, there's an instinct to be very serious when you're talking about vaginas, because you don't want people to not take you seriously, and also like we talk about some really difficult topics when it comes to vaginas, like abortion and FGM, and you can't joke about those kind of things, nor would you want to. But on the other hand, you do actually want to be lighthearted, because vaginas are funny. They involve sex, and sometimes when I sneeze, a little bit of period blood comes out, and I think that's funny. And you want to engage with people, and you're not going to, and humor is a really good way of doing it. But then it's about deciding, like, when do you have to go when do you have to go lighthearted, when do you have to go too heavy? And because of this tone, we have a lot of different kinds of reactions, and I kind of codified them in a few different ways. So we've got the people who are really, which are in my really, I don't have favorites. People who are older women who involved in the second wave, who are going through the menopause, and they fought for feminism, and they come to us and they say, I've been fighting for a place like this my whole life, and I wish I had it when I was a kid in the 70s, or earlier than that. Or people who are fourth wave feminists, you know, saying like, I'm so glad that this is now part of our movement. And even parents have come to us saying, you know, I'm so happy you exist because I want to bring up my child in a shame-free way, and this is part of doing that. Especially single dads have come to the Vagina Museum saying, you know, I need to teach my daughter about what's going to happen to her body, and I don't know how. So, you know, I'm glad I could bring to the Vagina Museum. But obviously not everyone is as happy, and how you deal with those is really difficult, because you do want to engage with them. You know, as a museum, we don't want to lock anyone out. And so engaging with people who don't like your idea is very important. So how do we do that? Well, there's the Morality Brigade, as I like to call it, the people who say, you know, vaginas are really inappropriate and we shouldn't be talking about it in a public space. Usually, when it comes to people like that, I'm very serious with them, and I say, you know, well, people, that this stigma and shame is really hurting people. People are very unlikely to go get help when they have incontinence, or when they have extreme period pain, or when they're bleeding after sex, which is a symptom of cervical cancer. So people are not getting the medical help they need simply because of body shame. And usually that's enough to get people round, and they're like, yeah, okay, I guess, you know, we should be teaching people about health. Then there are the trolls, people who love to make a good joke. Are you closed once a month? For refurbishment? I usually just joke back. Because then then they say, oh, you're not an angry feminist, and they join in the joke. There are people who get very angry because we're trans inclusive. I'm still figuring that one out, but the fact that we're trans inclusive is not changing. And then there are the people who are somewhat unimpressed because they have this idea of a museum being this huge British museum type thing, with loads of exhibits, and then they're like, oh, you're so small. And then you just have to be honest with them. And we say, you know, well, donate to our crowdfunder so we can become bigger. So in short, at the heart of all our engagement is tone, and making sure that we are adapting our tone according to the situation and to the audience. And that's one of the things that I really like about the Vagina Museum.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that, Florence. Again, a really fascinating, unique insight into the sector. And I think it's beautiful the way you have created a space that is very much funded by people and for people. It is built by the community and represents them. So it's a really nice story to hear. Our third panellist today is Stephen Welsh, and he's going to give us his unique angle and the work that he has done in the Slavery Museum and also in the giving back of sacred objects. So let's hear from Stephen.
Brilliant, thanks, Jamie. So, yeah, as I said in my introduction, after 15 years as a curator working at the International Slavery Museum and Manchester Museum, and having been a committee member for the National Heritage Lottery Fund North since 2016, what I'll do with you over the next several minutes or so is I'll be sharing with you how I think co-curation, decolonisation and repatriation processes are transforming museum collections and the way in which we interact with them, and how they've also informed and inspired what my definition of effective museum engagement is. So to begin with, how are collections changing? Well, of course, co-curation, decolonisation and repatriation, they are all transforming collections. And as a consequence, quite rightly, they're being contested, they're being revitalised, and attempts are being made to make them representative of the UK in the 21st century. So we can see how collections are changing as a consequence of all these processes, but how are they affecting the way in which we interact with those collections? So almost 2 years ago now, Manchester Museum literally put out an open call for co-curators to come forward to help create the new South Asia Gallery. And this is a partnership gallery with the British Museum due to open at Manchester Museum in 2022. And what happened is, quite amazingly, a collective of about 30 co-curators from all walks of life that are connected in some way with South Asia in Manchester and Greater Manchester and beyond has now emerged. And so I worked on this project up until a couple of months ago, when I became freelance, but my very amazing colleague Nusrat Ahmed, who I worked alongside during that time, is now leading the project. and she's doing a fabulous job. So do go to the Manchester Museum website and you'll find out about the project blog and about what's going on at the moment. And so these co-curators, this collective, they're in the process of curating their stories and experiences in this radically different gallery. But it's not just a case of them selecting objects, which of course they're doing. They're also co-producing, co-designing the gallery. So literally only a few weeks ago, Nusrat managed to get all of these co-curators on a Zoom to interview for the designer of the gallery, which was a phenomenal feat to get all these different people in all different parts of Greater Manchester together, line up all the designers to be interviewed. And it looked like an absolutely amazing feat. So they're picking objects, they're co-curating, they're co-designing, co-producing, but also, which is fundamentally important in terms of decolonisation, this isn't a passive or benign exercise where you simply select objects. And so we've explored collections at Manchester Museum and the British Museum. So the co-curators have scrutinised how those South Asian collections at Manchester Museum and the British Museum have ended up in their possession. And of course, it's absolutely vital when you're doing this type of engagement work that museums acknowledge the colonial origins of their collections currently in their care, and when necessary, take action by deepening engagement and supporting repatriation. So then that brings me on very nicely to the other project at Manchester Museum that I'd like to talk about, which is, of course, the repatriation of secret, sacred and ceremonial objects to Australia's First Nations peoples. Now, some of you will already know that Manchester Museum has a long history of engaging in repatriation, particularly with ancestral human remains. But this was the first time the museum had returned objects. So it was a phenomenal thing to be involved with, and one of the most amazing engagement projects I'd worked on to date, and that happened to happen fantastically alongside the co-curation of the South Asia Gallery. So for those of you who don't know, towards the end of 2019, Manchester Museum unconditionally repatriated. And when I say unconditionally, that means that the objects that we returned didn't go back to another museum in Australia. They went back to those Aboriginal communities, to the descendants of the people who made and used them, so we could support their ambition to revitalise their culture. So they've gone back to those spaces, back to those communities, and they're being used for the rituals that they were always intended to be. So yeah, we unconditionally repatriated 43 secret, sacred and ceremonial objects to Australia's First Nations peoples. But this was part of a bigger project which was being run by AATSIS, or the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, and it was part of their Return of Cultural Heritage project. And one of the most impressive engagement projects I've participated in. And the thing about the South Asia Gallery co-curation and the unconditional repatriation is that at the centre of what the museum and AATSIS are doing are communities. They don't write the project proposal and then go and elicit communities to participate. They're there from the very beginning. So then that brings me on finally to, in my opinion, what does effective engagement mean? And what I'll do here is draw on some of my experience as a committee member for the National Heritage Lottery Fund as well. So as I said, from the very outset of any engagement project in a museum, all parties, every single party involved, whether it's a community group or it's a university group, whoever it is that you're collaborating with on this project, all parties need to be in the room together and co-produce the actual project proposal itself. And to do this, museums need to invest serious amounts of time, money, and resources, not only in terms of developing relationships, but also maintaining them with those cultures and communities who are most intimately connected with those collections that are currently in our care. And thinking about the structure of engagement projects as well. So you often have a development period, and then the development leads to the delivery. What I think we need to do, those development periods are quite often where all the engagement takes place. Those development periods need to be extended to match or equal the delivery period. And we can perhaps have a conversation about that, because far too often the development period, which involves the majority of the engagement, is tiny in comparison to the delivery. And when you do have engagement in the delivery phase, it quite often peters out or wanes. So in terms of the structure, I think we need to approach it from that perspective, but also in terms of museum professionals. So we need to start to transcend the barriers between various museum professionals. So curators, engagement staff, learning staff, conservators. So I was a collections curator. I was responsible for the World Cultures Collection, the ethnographic collection at Manchester Museum, but I was also leading on and working with others on large scale engagement projects. So it can be done. We have to drop some of those barriers. And you can't just have engagement impacting on the periphery. So it can't just be about delivering an exhibition. Engagement has to shape the organization. It has to shift and transform structures internally. And the last point I'll leave you with, I mean, quite often I find it can be quite intimidating engagement where people may not know where to start, but simply put, just ask. Simply just ask. If you don't know, just ask communities what their ambitions, aspirations, and needs are, and work with them in partnership and collaboration to realize them. Just go and have a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, go to them, find out what they're interested in, and kickstart that relationship. Thanks, Jamie.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephen. And that brings us to a close today. Hopefully you've enjoyed this tour around museum engagement, and hopefully you've seen how actually inviting people into the museum, connecting and explicitly targeting communities to co-produce, to work with them, to show that museums can represent any of the communities around the world. Representation, co-production are now the words and the standard bearers of excellent museum practice. Hope to see you again next week.